I sat in the back row of the private banking suite, in a chair that was not meant for me, listening to people I had raised, fed, clothed, and loved more than my own life discuss what they believed was already theirs. The lawyer had not even opened the folder yet. The air smelled of leather and cold coffee. Somewhere outside the tall windows, the city moved on, indifferent to the fact that my entire world was about to be dismantled by the people sitting closest to me. My daughter-in-law, Vanessa, sat at the head of the polished table as though she had been born there. She wore black, of course, the kind of tasteful morning black that costs more than most people's monthly rent, and she had draped a strand of pearls over her collarbone that I recognized instantly. They had belonged to my mother. I had given them to Vanessa on her wedding day 11 years ago, back when I still believed she loved my son and not simply the world he came from. She leaned back in the leather chair, crossed her legs, and looked at me the way you might look at an old coat you were finally ready to donate. "Don't expect a penny of my husband's 50 million, she said, her voice smooth and unhurried, as if she were commenting on the weather. "You had your time, Eleanor. This is our family now." The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when everyone is waiting to see if the wounded animal will fight back or simply lie down. My son, Daniel, sat beside her, staring at his folded hands on the table, unable to meet my eyes, exactly as he had done 3 days earlier at the wedding when he told me I was not on the list. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I folded my hands in my lap, the same way I had folded them 1,000 times across 1,000 negotiating tables over the course of 30 years building an empire from nothing, and I waited. Exactly 4 seconds later, the heavy glass door of the conference room opened. My attorney, Marcus Bell, walked in without a word of greeting. He crossed the room in 6 long strides and set a sealed manila envelope directly in front of Vanessa. He did not sit down. He simply looked at her, then at my son, then finally at me, and gave the smallest nod, as if to say, "It is time." Before I tell you exactly what was inside that envelope, and how I dismantled the people who thought a grieving 72-year-old widow was too broken to fight back, let me take you back 3 days, to the morning of my granddaughter's wedding, when this entire nightmare truly began. The scent of white lilies still clung to my black dress from my husband Richard's funeral 6 weeks earlier. 48 years of marriage, ended by a stroke that took him in his sleep on a Tuesday morning while I was making coffee in the next room. I had not even heard him go. I found him with his reading glasses still on, a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on his chest, as though he had simply drifted off mid-sentence and forgotten to come back. The house we shared for 4 decades felt like a museum now, every room a monument to a life that no longer existed. I stood in front of my closet that morning, running my fingers along the dresses Richard used to compliment, trying to decide which one was appropriate for watching my only granddaughter marry the love of her life. I settled on a soft lavender suit, the color Richard always said made me look like spring itself, even at 72. I still remembered every detail of his funeral, 6 weeks earlier. The way one remembers the worst days of a life, almost against one's own will, every image preserved with unbearable clarity. Nearly 400 people had come, filling the church until ushers were setting up folding chairs in the vestibule, employees who had driven our trucks for 30 years standing shoulder to shoulder with business partners from 3 continents, all of them there to mourn a man who had built something lasting out of nothing but stubbornness and a willingness to work harder than anyone believed 2 young people from nowhere had any right to work. Daniel had delivered the eulogy, his voice cracking twice as he spoke about his father teaching him to drive a delivery van at 14, about long summers spent loading boxes in the heat, about a man who never once, in 42 years, missed a single one of his son's birthdays despite building an empire that could easily have consumed every waking hour he had. I remembered thinking, sitting in the front pew in a black dress I had bought specifically for the occasion because I owned nothing somber enough for a funeral, that Daniel still loved his father, whatever else had gone wrong in the years since, and that whatever fractures existed in our family, they had not yet reached all the way down to the foundation. I had been wrong about that, of course, though I would not learn exactly how wrong for another 3 days, standing at the edge of a vineyard wedding, being told by that same grieving son that I was not on the list. I drove myself to the venue, a sprawling vineyard estate 2 hours outside the city that Daniel and Vanessa had rented for what I later learned cost nearly $400,000. I parked in the overflow lot, since the valet line was reserved, apparently, for guests whose names appeared on a certain list. I did not think anything of it at the time. I simply walked the long gravel path toward the ceremony space, clutching a small wrapped gift, my heart aching with a strange mixture of grief and joy, the way grief and joy so often arrive together in the years after you bury someone you loved. Daniel met me at the edge of the white folding chairs. He was dressed in a charcoal suit I had bought him for his college graduation 15 years earlier, tailored now to fit the man he had become, a man who ran half of my late husband's logistics empire and yet somehow still needed his wife's permission to breathe. He did not hug me. He did not ask how I was holding up, 6 weeks into widowhood, standing alone at a family celebration for the first time without Richard beside me. He simply stepped in front of me, blocking my path toward the seats, his eyes darting nervously over my shoulder toward the white tent where Vanessa stood directing caterers with the crisp authority of a woman commanding an army. "Mom," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic, though the apology never quite arrived. "You're not on the list." I stared at him, certain I had misheard. "What list, Daniel?" "The guest list. For the ceremony seating." Vanessa handled it. She said the front section is reserved for immediate family and close friends of the couple, and honestly, Mom, given everything with Dad's estate and the lawyers and all of that, she thought it might be awkward. "For everyone. If you were up front." I looked past him toward the white chairs, rows and rows of them, filled with people I recognized from Vanessa's side. Business associates of Daniel's, a scattering of Richard's old colleagues who apparently had made whatever cut I had not. My own granddaughter, Sophie, the baby I had rocked to sleep more nights than her own mother had, was somewhere behind that white tent in a wedding dress, and her own grandmother had just been told she was not welcome to sit and watch her walk down the aisle. "I am her grandmother," I said quietly. "I know," Daniel said, and for one brief second I saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been shame, if he had still possessed the capacity for it. "There's a seat for you in the back. By the caterer's tent. You can still see everything." "It's fine, Mom." "It's fine." It was not fine. But I did not scream. I did not cause a scene at my granddaughter's wedding. I nodded, thanked him for his consideration, as though he had done me some great courtesy, and I walked to the back row, past 200 guests who had somehow all been deemed more essential to this family than I was, and I sat down in a folding chair beside a table stacked with extra champagne flutes, and I watched my granddaughter marry a man I had never even been introduced to from 40 yards away, unable to hear a single word of the vows. I did not cry. Not there. Not where anyone could see. I had spent 50 years learning that the woman who loses her composure is the woman who loses the room, a lesson I had learned from Richard himself in the earliest days of building our company, when men twice our size tried to intimidate us out of every warehouse contract we ever fought for. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, and I watched the ceremony end, watched the reception begin, watched 200 people rise to dance and toast and celebrate a marriage I had been permitted to witness only from a distance, like a stranger peering through a window at someone else's family. It was during the reception, while I sat alone at a small table near the edge of the tent, nursing a glass of water I had not touched, that I overheard something that would change everything. 2 women were seated at the table behind me, their backs to me, unaware I was close enough to hear. I recognized one of their voices as belonging to Priya, Vanessa's closest friend since college, a woman who had been a bridesmaid at Daniel and Vanessa's own wedding 11 years earlier. "Can you believe she actually pulled it off?" the other woman said, her voice dropped low but not low enough. "Getting Richard to redo the trust like that, right before he died? I mean, the timing alone." "She's been planning this for years," Priya said, and I felt my entire body go still, every muscle locking in place like a deer that has just heard the snap of a branch in the woods. "Vanessa told me herself. She said once the old man's health started slipping, it was only a matter of getting the right people in front of him at the right time. The estate attorney, the new financial advisor, all of it. She practically handpicked every person who touched those documents in his final year. And Daniel just goes along with it?" Priya laughed, a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it at all. "Daniel does whatever Vanessa tells him to do. He has for 11 years. The man doesn't pick out his own socks without her approval. She's been telling him for months that once Eleanor is dealt with, they'll finally have full control of the company and the estate. 50 million, split however they want it. No interference. No old woman looking over their shoulder asking questions about where the money's going. I sat perfectly still, staring at the untouched water in front of me, while the two women continued their conversation, entirely unaware that the old woman they were discussing was sitting 4 feet away, absorbing every word like a slow-acting poison entering her bloodstream. Richard had redone the trust before he died, and I had known nothing about it. I want to be very clear about something, because I know how this sounds, and I know how easy it is to doubt an old woman's memory when grief has clouded so much of the last 6 weeks. But I built that company with my husband. I sat beside him at that same battered folding table 38 years ago, back when Whitfield Logistics was nothing more than 2 rented delivery vans and a dream neither of us could afford. I kept the books by hand for the first 9 years. I answered every phone call, negotiated every early contract, co-signed every loan that kept us from going under during 3 separate recessions. When people say behind every great man there is a great woman, they are usually being generous to the man. In our case, it would be more accurate to say beside every great man was a woman doing half the work and receiving a fraction of the credit, which I accepted, gladly, because I loved him, and because I trusted that whatever we built together belonged to both of us, and would remain that way until the day one of us was gone. Richard and I had a trust, drafted 18 years earlier by an attorney we had used for our entire married life. A trust that named me as primary beneficiary and sole trustee in the event of his death, with the company and our combined estate to pass fully into my control, with provisions for Daniel and Sophie to follow after me. It was ironclad. It was ours. We had reviewed it together every few years, most recently only 14 months before Richard's death, and nothing about it had changed. Or so I believed. Until I sat at a wedding reception I had been relegated to the back row of, listening to 2 women casually discuss how my daughter-in-law had spent years engineering a replacement. I did not confront anyone that night. I finished my glass of water. I found Sophie for exactly 90 seconds amid the crowd of well-wishers to tell her she looked beautiful, which she did, and I drove myself home in the dark, my hands steady on the wheel despite the storm building behind my ribs. The drive gave me time to think. And thinking for me has always meant remembering. I thought about the woman I had been at 29, standing in a gravel parking lot behind a rented warehouse with Richard, counting out the last of our savings on the hood of a borrowed truck, trying to decide whether we had enough left to make payroll for our 3 employees or enough to buy the diesel we needed to fulfill a contract that would keep the company alive another month. We chose the diesel. We went without groceries that week, living on what we could scrape together from the pantry. And Richard promised me, holding my hands in the cold night air, that one day we would never have to make a choice like that again. We kept that promise to each other for the better part of 5 decades. We built Whitfield Logistics from 2 rented vans into a company with 41 distribution centers spanning 11 states, a company that employed nearly 3,000 people, a company whose name Richard's own father, a dock worker who had never earned more than modest wages in his life, would not have recognized as belonging to the son he raised in a 2-bedroom apartment above a shoe repair shop. We built it together, every step of it, through recessions and lawsuits, and one particularly brutal year when a competitor tried to buy out 3 of our largest clients simultaneously, nearly bankrupting us before Richard and I spent 11 consecutive nights redesigning our entire pricing structure at our kitchen table, fueled by nothing but coffee and stubbornness. I remembered all of it driving home from that wedding, and by the time I pulled into our driveway, the same driveway Richard and I had paved ourselves the summer after our 10th anniversary, because we could not yet afford to hire it out, I understood something with a clarity that felt almost physical, a weight settling into my bones. I had not spent 5 decades building something, only to let it slip quietly out of my hands, because a room full of people decided a grieving 72-year-old woman no longer belonged in the front row of her own life. I did not sleep that night. I sat in Richard's study, surrounded by the smell of his pipe tobacco that still clung faintly to the leather chairs, and I began to think, the way I used to think during our hardest years in business, when disaster was circling and the only thing standing between survival and ruin was my own clear head. The next morning, I called our longtime family attorney, the man who had drafted our original trust, a man named Harold Whitmore, who had known Richard since they were both young men clawing their way up in this city. I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, whether he was aware of any recent changes to the Whitfield family trust. There was a long silence on the line before he answered. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "I haven't handled anything for Richard in over a year. He told me last spring that he was consolidating his estate planning with a new firm, someone Vanessa had recommended. A younger attorney. I assumed you knew. I had not known. Richard had never mentioned it. Not once in 14 months had my husband told me he was quietly moving our entire life's work into the hands of an attorney chosen by our daughter-in-law. I thanked Harold, hung up the phone, and sat very still in the silence of Richard's empty study, feeling something shift inside my chest, something cold and clear and entirely unfamiliar. It was not the grief I had been carrying for 6 weeks. It was something older, something that had lain dormant since the earliest, hungriest days of building our company, when I had learned exactly what it meant to fight for something with everything I had. I drove to Whitfield Logistics headquarters the following morning, arriving before 7, before the parking lot filled with the cars of employees who had known me for decades. I still had a key card, still had a small office on the executive floor that Richard had insisted I keep even after I stepped back from day-to-day operations a decade earlier to focus on our philanthropic foundation. I swiped my card at the executive entrance, expecting the familiar green light and quiet click of the door unlocking. Instead, the panel blinked red. Access denied. I swiped it again. Red light. Access denied. Having some trouble, Eleanor? I turned to find Gregory Sands standing near the elevator bank, our chief financial officer, a man in his mid-40s who had joined the company 8 years earlier and risen quickly through ranks that Richard had always privately said moved a bit faster than Gregory's actual competence warranted. He wore an expensive suit and an expression of practiced, hollow sympathy. My card seems to be malfunctioning, I said. Ah, right, Gregory said, tucking his hands into his pockets with the easy comfort of a man who knew exactly what was happening and felt no particular urgency to explain it kindly. We're doing a full security overhaul this month. Vanessa thought it was time to modernize the access protocols, given everything happening with the estate transition. I probably should have mentioned it. Your clearance is being reviewed along with a few others. A few others. Legacy access holders, Gregory said smoothly. Nothing personal, Eleanor. Just good corporate hygiene. I'm sure it'll all be sorted out once the estate matters are finalized. I looked into his eyes and saw exactly what I needed to see, a man who knew he was lying and knew that I knew it and did not particularly carry their way. The old me, the me from decades earlier, might have demanded he override the system immediately, might have made a scene loud enough to summon security and force the issue. But I was no longer 29, fighting for our first contract in a warehouse district that did not respect women who raised their voices. I was 72 years old, and I understood now that the woman who reacts too quickly gives away her hand before she has counted her cards. Of course, I said pleasantly. Modernization is important. Thank you for explaining, Gregory. I turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on my back the entire length of the corridor, and I did not look behind me. I drove home and sat once more in Richard's study, and this time I did something I had not done in over a decade. I opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one that required a small brass key I had always assumed was for nothing more important than old photographs, and I found, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed business cards, a slim leather notebook filled with Richard's careful handwriting. It was a log. Dates, names, numbers. Richard had been keeping notes, quietly, for the better part of a year, about irregularities he had noticed in the company's financial reports. Small discrepancies at first, thousands of dollars here and there, easily written off as accounting errors. Then larger ones. Payments to vendors that did not appear in any procurement records I recognized. A consulting firm called Meridian Strategic Partners that had received nearly $2 million over 8 months for services no one on the operations team could identify. The final entry, dated only 3 weeks before Richard's death, was a single line, underlined twice in his familiar slanted handwriting. Something is wrong. Need to talk to Eleanor. Cannot trust GS or the new attorney. Waiting until after Sophie's wedding to avoid disrupting things. He had never gotten the chance to talk to me. He died 2 weeks before he intended to sit me down and share what he had discovered, and in the chaos and grief of his funeral, whatever he had been planning to do about it had died along with him. I sat in his study for a long time, holding that notebook, feeling the full weight of what my husband had been carrying silently in his final months, worried about disrupting our granddaughter's wedding plans, worried about upsetting a family he still believed, even then, was fundamentally good and simply misguided. Richard had always been more trusting than me. It was one of the things I loved most about him, and I now understood one of the things that had made him vulnerable in the end. I was not going to make the same mistake. I picked up the phone and called the one person I knew could help me find out exactly what my daughter-in-law and my chief financial officer had built behind my back while I was busy burying my husband. Her name was Diane Okafor, a former forensic accountant turned private investigator who had done work for our foundation years earlier, tracking down a nonprofit partner who had been quietly diverting grant funds. She was sharp, discreet, and entirely without sentiment when it came to uncovering the truth, which was precisely what I needed. I met her the following afternoon in a small coffee shop far from anywhere either of us was likely to run into people who knew my family. I brought Richard's notebook and a folder of financial statements I had pulled from an old home office backup drive Richard kept for tax purposes, records that predated whatever new system Gregory Sands had implemented. Diane read through the notebook slowly, her expression unreadable, the way I imagine a surgeon looks when studying an X-ray of something they already suspect is malignant. "This is serious, Eleanor," she said finally. "If even half of what your husband documented is accurate, someone has been systematically draining money out of this company for close to a year, funneling it through what looks like a shell consulting firm. And if your estate documents were altered around the same time frame, that's not a coincidence. That's a coordinated plan. Can you find out who's behind it?" "All of it." Diane closed the notebook and looked at me with the same steady, unflinching expression I imagined she used when confronting embezzlers twice her size in boardrooms across the city. "Give me 2 weeks," she said. "And Eleanor, you should know, once I start pulling these threads, I'm not going to be gentle about what I find. Are you prepared for that? Because sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who surprise us the most." "I raised my son to tell the truth," I said quietly, staring down at the folder between us. I would like to believe he still remembers how, even if his wife has spent 11 years teaching him otherwise. "But I did not ask you here to protect anyone's feelings, Diane, including mine. I asked you here because I intend to know exactly what happened to my husband's trust and my company's money, in full, regardless of whose name ends up attached to it." "Then I'll get started today," Diane said, already reaching for her bag. Before she stood, she paused, studying me for a moment with an expression that was not quite sympathy, something closer to respect. "For what it's worth, Eleanor, most clients who walk in here after losing a spouse want me to prove they're wrong, want me to find some innocent explanation that lets them keep believing the people around them. You haven't asked me for that once. I spent 48 years married to a man who never once needed comforting lies to make hard decisions," I said. "I am not about to start needing them now at 72, with considerably less time left to waste on comfortable fictions." I thought of Daniel, standing in front of me at the wedding, telling me I was not on the list. I thought of Vanessa's pearls, my mother's pearls, draped around her throat as she looked at me across that conference table with such casual contempt. "I have been prepared for a very long time," I said. I simply did not know it yet. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. I continued to play the part everyone expected of me, the grieving, slightly bewildered widow, quietly fading into the background of a family that no longer had much use for her. I let Daniel's calls go to voicemail for a day or two before returning them with a soft, tired voice. I told Vanessa, when she called to ask if I would be attending the reading of the will the following month, that whatever the family decided would be fine with me, that I only wanted peace, that I had no interest in conflict during such a difficult time. Vanessa's voice, when she heard those words, carried an unmistakable note of satisfaction, the tone of a general watching an enemy retreat exactly as planned. Meanwhile, in the quiet hours when no one was watching, I was anything but retreating. Diane's first report arrived 9 days later, and it confirmed everything Richard had suspected and more. Meridian Strategic Partners did not exist as a legitimate consulting firm. It was a shell company, registered in a neighboring state under the name of a limited liability corporation whose sole listed officer was a woman named Patricia Alvarez, a name that meant nothing to me until Diane produced a marriage certificate showing that Patricia Alvarez was Gregory Sands' sister-in-law. Over the previous 11 months, Meridian had received wire transfers totaling nearly $3.4 million from Whitfield Logistics accounts, all approved under Gregory's financial authority. all coded as strategic consulting expenses that had somehow avoided the scrutiny of our board because Gregory had quietly restructured our internal audit process shortly after taking over as chief financial officer 8 years earlier, ensuring that expenses under a certain threshold, spread across multiple smaller transactions, never triggered a secondary review. But the money trail was only half of what Diane uncovered. The new estate attorney Vanessa had recommended to Richard, a man named Christopher Doyle, had no independent record of estate planning work prior to 18 months earlier. Before that, his only documented professional history was 3 years spent working directly under the same law firm that represented Vanessa's family's business interests, a mid-sized real estate development company that had, coincidentally, done substantial work with a construction firm partly owned by Gregory Sands' brother-in-law. It was, Diane explained to me over a second cup of coffee in the same quiet shop, precisely the kind of interconnected web that people build when they want plausible deniability at every layer, so that no single relationship looks damning on its own, and only someone willing to trace every thread will ever see the full shape of the spider. While Diane continued tracing the financial threads, I decided there was something I needed to do myself, something I could not simply hand off to an investigator, however skilled. Richard had always kept a safety deposit box at the small independent bank where we had opened our very first business account, decades before either of us could have imagined the empire that account would eventually help fund. I had not visited that box in years. Richard handled it, quietly, the way he handled most of our older paperwork, and I had never questioned it, because in 48 years of marriage, I had never once had reason to doubt that whatever my husband kept private, he kept private only because he trusted me to find it eventually, when the time was right. I drove to the bank on a Wednesday afternoon, presented my identification and the small brass key Richard had kept on his own ring for as long as I could remember, and sat alone in a private viewing room while a bank officer retrieved the long metal box and left me with it. Inside, beneath a stack of old property deeds and a faded photograph of the two of us standing in front of our very first warehouse, I found a small digital voice recorder, the kind Richard had always carried in his jacket pocket for dictating notes when he did not have time to write them down. I turned it on, my hands trembling slightly, and heard my husband's voice for the first time since his funeral, warm and familiar and utterly devastating in its ordinariness, as though he might simply walk into the room at any moment and ask what I thought I was doing going through his private things. The recording was dated 4 days before his death. His voice was tired, but clear. "If anyone besides Eleanor is listening to this," he said, "then something has happened to me that I did not expect, and I want it on record that as of this recording, I have not signed any amendment to our family trust, nor do I intend to until I have personally reviewed the new documents with Harold Whitmore, our original attorney, and discussed everything with my wife. Christopher Doyle has pressured me twice this month to finalize signatures quickly, citing tax deadlines I have since confirmed with my accountant do not exist. I am growing increasingly certain that something is wrong, and I intend to address it directly with Eleanor after Sophie's wedding, because I do not want to cast a shadow over her happiness before then. If I have not done so by the time anyone hears this recording, please make certain my wife sees it." I sat alone in that small viewing room for nearly 40 minutes after the recording ended, listening to it a second time, and then a third, memorizing the exact cadence of his voice, the small pause before he said my name, the way he still, after 48 years, sounded faintly protective whenever he spoke of me. It was, I would later tell Marcus, the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case, not because it was legally the most damning, though it was certainly powerful, but because it confirmed something I had needed to hear more than I had realized. Richard had never stopped fighting for me, even in his final days, even when he did not yet fully understand the size of the fight he was walking into. I gave the recorder to Marcus the following morning. He listened to it once, in complete silence, and then looked up at me with an expression I had rarely seen on his face in 19 years of knowing him. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "this alone would likely be enough to void the trust amendment on its own merits. Combined with everything Diane has found, I don't think there is a courtroom in this state where Vanessa's attorneys could keep this case alive past the first hearing." "Good," I said. "Then let's make certain it never has the chance to." Diane's investigation continued in parallel, and 2 days later she called me with something that added an entirely new dimension to everything we had already uncovered. "There's one more thing," Diane said, sliding a final page across the table. "And I want you to be sitting down for this one, Eleanor, though I suppose you already are." The page was a printout of a text message thread, retrieved through means Diane did not explain and I did not ask about, exchanged between Vanessa and a number saved simply as G 8 months earlier. Vanessa, once the trust amendment goes through, we control everything before she even knows what happened. Doyle says it's airtight as long as Richard signs before his next physical. His memory issues will make it easy to argue diminished capacity later if she tries to contest it, but she won't. She trusts him completely. That's the whole point. Gee, and once Richard is out of the picture, Daniel signs off on whatever you need for the operational side. He doesn't ask questions. Vanessa, he never does. That's why I married him. I set the page down on the table and folded my hands, the way I had learned to fold them decades ago, to keep them from shaking in front of people I did not fully trust. Richard had never had memory issues. Not real ones. A little forgetfulness here and there, the ordinary kind that comes with being 74 years old, nothing that any honest doctor would have called diminished capacity. But Vanessa had been building a narrative, quietly, patiently, for months, laying groundwork not just to redirect our estate but to ensure that if I ever did contest it, there would be a manufactured medical argument waiting to discredit my husband's own competence, and by extension, discredit my claim to what had always rightfully belonged to both of us. He never does, I repeated quietly, staring at Vanessa's words about my own son. That's why I married him. I sat with that sentence for a long time, feeling something in my chest that was no longer simply grief or anger, but something closer to clarity. My son had not been a victim in all of this exactly, but he had been something almost worse, a tool, willingly handed over, a man so accustomed to letting his wife make every decision that he had never once stopped to ask what those decisions were costing the mother who raised him. I thought about confronting Daniel directly, sitting him down the way Richard might have, laying the evidence in front of him and asking him to explain himself. But I had learned enough about my son over 42 years to know exactly how that conversation would go. He would deny everything he could deny, minimize everything he could not, and ultimately retreat into the same passive helplessness that had defined his entire adult life, protected always by his wife's willingness to make the hard decisions so he never had to. No. If I confronted him now alone, quietly, he would simply run to Vanessa, and Vanessa would accelerate whatever timeline she had planned, perhaps even push the trust amendment through before I had gathered enough to stop it entirely. I needed to let them believe they had already won. I called Marcus Bell the following morning. Marcus had been Richard's litigation attorney for nearly 2 decades, a formidable man in his early 60s who had built his entire reputation on dismantling corporate fraud cases that everyone else believed were unwinnable. He had represented Whitfield Logistics in exactly 3 major legal battles over the years, and won all 3 so decisively that our competitors had learned to settle rather than face him in a courtroom. I told him everything. The wedding. The overheard conversation. Richard's notebook. Diane's findings. The shell company. The falsified narrative of diminished capacity. The text messages between my daughter-in-law and my chief financial officer. Marcus listened without interrupting, the way he always had, taking careful notes on a legal pad in handwriting nearly as illegible as Richard's had been. Eleanor, he said finally, if even a portion of this holds up, we're not looking at a simple estate dispute. We're looking at fraud, embezzlement, and quite possibly elder financial abuse, given the timeline of when this trust amendment was executed relative to Richard's health. This is the kind of case that ends careers and puts people in prison, not just the kind that gets settled quietly in a mediation room. Good, I said, and I meant it with every fiber of my being. Then let's make sure it ends exactly that way. We spent the following days building what Marcus called, with grim satisfaction, an unassailable record. Diane continued digging, uncovering 3 additional shell entities connected to Gregory Sands, tracing over $5 million in total diverted funds across nearly 2 years, far longer than I had initially realized. She also uncovered something else, something I had not expected and did not particularly want to know, but which Marcus insisted was relevant to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy against me. Gregory Sands and Vanessa had known each other long before he ever joined Whitfield Logistics. They had attended the same business school, a full decade before Vanessa ever met my son. It was Vanessa, in fact, who had personally recommended Gregory for the chief financial officer position 8 years earlier, presenting him to Richard as a brilliant young talent she had encountered through her professional network, never once mentioning the years-long friendship, or, as bank records eventually suggested, something considerably closer than friendship that connected them. I will not pretend that discovering the true depth of Vanessa's deception did not wound me. I had welcomed that woman into my family for 11 years. I had celebrated her birthdays, hosted her baby showers when Sophie was born, defended her to friends who whispered that she seemed cold, seemed calculating, seemed like a woman who had married my son for reasons that had very little to do with love. I had defended her again and again, because I wanted so badly to believe my son had chosen well, that the family we had built together was solid, was real, was worth the sacrifices Richard and I had made to give our children every advantage we never had. Instead, I had spent over a decade unknowingly harboring the architect of my own eventual destruction. Marcus and I met with the district attorney's white-collar crimes division 11 days after my first meeting with Diane. I brought Richard's notebook, sealed now in a protective folder, along with the full binder Diane had compiled, financial records, shell company documentation, the text message thread, a forensic timeline connecting every fraudulent transaction to Gregory's authorization, and sworn statements from 2 former Whitfield Logistics employees Diane had located. Mid-level accountants who had noticed irregularities years earlier and been quietly dismissed under manufactured performance complaints when they raised questions. The lead prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Assistant District Attorney Renata Cole, reviewed the materials with an expression that grew increasingly grave as she turned each page. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said finally, "if this evidence holds up under forensic audit, and based on what I'm seeing here I have every confidence it will, we're looking at charges including wire fraud, embezzlement, and potentially conspiracy to commit elder financial exploitation, given the manufactured medical narrative around your late husband's competency. This is a strong case. We would like to move forward with a formal investigation immediately." "There is one thing I need," I said. "I need time. 3 weeks. I need this investigation to remain confidential until a specific date." Renata Cole studied me for a long moment. "May I ask why?" "Because," I said, "my family believes they have already won. They are meeting with their attorney in 3 weeks to formally read what they believe is my husband's final will, redistributing everything to exclude me entirely. I want to be in that room when the truth comes out. I have spent my entire life building something alongside my husband, and I would like the opportunity to watch the people who tried to steal it discover, in front of everyone, who matters, exactly how badly they miscalculated." Renata Cole's mouth curved into something that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "I think that can be arranged, Mrs. Whitfield. We'll coordinate the timing of any arrests to align with your family meeting, assuming the forensic audit confirms everything we're seeing here, which, given the strength of this documentation, I do not expect to be a problem." For the next 3 weeks, I lived 2 lives simultaneously. In the life my family saw, I was Eleanor Whitfield, grieving widow, recently humiliated grandmother, a woman quietly fading into irrelevance, calling Daniel occasionally with soft, tired questions about how Sophie's honeymoon was going, never once mentioning the wedding, never once mentioning the locked office door, never once betraying so much as a flicker of the storm building beneath my calm surface. I let Vanessa believe, through every carefully calibrated phone call and message, that I had accepted my diminished role in the family with the passive resignation of a woman who no longer had the strength to fight. In my other life, I sat in Marcus Bell's office nearly every day, reviewing forensic accounting reports that grew more damning by the week. Diane uncovered evidence that Christopher Doyle, the estate attorney Vanessa had recommended to Richard, had backdated key documents to make it appear as though certain estate planning conversations had taken place months earlier than they actually had, a criminal act of its own that would eventually cost him his law license and considerably more. We built, piece by piece, a case so thorough that even Marcus, a man not prone to overstatement, called it the cleanest fraud prosecution file he had assembled in his entire career. I also spent those 3 weeks doing something else, something I had not expected to find myself doing at 72 years old, grieving my husband while quietly preparing to expose my own son and daughter-in-law. I spent time with Richard's old business partners, the men and women who had known him since the earliest days of Whitfield Logistics, gathering their support, ensuring that when the truth finally came out, I would not be facing my family alone in that room. I visited our longtime chief operations officer, a woman named Ruth Alvarado who had been with us for 31 years and had been quietly pushed out of most major decisions since Gregory's rise to power. Ruth wept when I showed her Richard's notebook and then, wiping her eyes, told me she had suspected something was wrong with the accounts for over a year, but had been too afraid of losing her pension to say anything. "You will not lose your pension," I told her. "I promise you that. Whatever happens in that room in 3 weeks, the people who have been loyal to this family will not suffer for it." I also reached out to Sophie, my granddaughter, gently, carefully, without revealing the full scope of what was happening, only enough to let her know that her grandmother loved her, that whatever conflict was brewing within the family had nothing to do with her, and that I hoped, when the dust settled, she would still want her grandmother in her life. Sophie, bless her, called me in tears, apologizing for the wedding seating, telling me she had not known, that her mother had handled the guest list entirely on her own and Sophie had simply trusted that everything was being managed correctly. I believed her. Sophie had always been the one bright, unspoiled thing in that household, a child who had somehow grown up decent despite everything around her, and I made a silent promise to myself that whatever justice I extracted from her parents, I would find a way to protect her from the fallout as much as possible. "Grandma, I'm so sorry," Sophie said, her voice breaking over the phone from wherever she and her new husband were honeymooning, some island whose name I did not catch through her tears. "If I had known, I would have walked out there myself and pulled a chair up front for you. I promise you that. I know you would have, sweetheart," I told her, and I meant it completely. "None of this is your burden to carry. You simply enjoy your marriage, and let your old grandmother handle the rest." She did not know, of course, exactly what handling the rest would come to mean in the weeks that followed. I did not tell her, not then, not until the truth was already public record and there was nothing left to protect her from except the natural grief of learning her own parents had built a life together on foundations far shakier than she had ever imagined. 10 days before the scheduled will reading, I did something I had debated for a long time before finally deciding it was necessary. I invited Daniel to lunch alone without Vanessa at a small diner on the edge of town that Richard and I used to visit in our earliest years, back when a plate of eggs and toast was a luxury we allowed ourselves only after closing a good contract. Daniel had not been there since he was a teenager. I chose it deliberately, hoping the familiarity might loosen something in him that 11 years of Vanessa's polish had sealed shut. He arrived looking tired, his tie slightly loosened, and slid into the vinyl booth across from me with the wary posture of a man who suspected, on some level, that this was not simply a mother wanting to see her son. "You look well, Mom," he said, which was a lie, and we both knew it. Since I had lost weight I could not afford to lose in the 6 weeks since Richard's death and had not slept properly in nearly as long. "I want to ask you something, Daniel," I said once the waitress had taken our order and left us alone. "And I want you to actually think before you answer, rather than simply telling me whatever you believe will end this conversation the fastest." He nodded, some old, buried instinct from childhood recognizing the tone I had used on him 1,000 times growing up, the tone that meant this was not a moment for deflection. "Did you know," I asked, "that your father was planning to speak to me about serious financial irregularities at the company before he died? Irregularities involving Gregory Sands." Something flickered behind Daniel's eyes, quick and involuntary, gone almost before I could name it. Mom, I don't know anything about that. Dad never mentioned anything to me. And did you know," I continued, keeping my voice level, "that the attorney who drew up the new trust amendment, the one Vanessa recommended to your father, has no independent estate planning experience prior to being connected to this family through her business associates?" Daniel's hands, resting on the table, went very still. "Mom, where is this coming from?" "I am asking you a simple question, Daniel. Did you know?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at his folded hands, and when he finally looked up at me, I saw, for just a heartbeat, the boy I had raised. The boy who used to come to me crying when he'd made a mistake he didn't know how to fix, before he had learned, somewhere in the last decade, to bury that instinct beneath a much more convenient kind of silence. "I knew something felt off," he admitted quietly. "I asked Vanessa about it once a few months ago. About why Dad was suddenly using a different attorney, why Gregory kept requesting authorization for expenses I didn't recognize. She told me I was overthinking it, that Dad trusted her recommendations, that I should focus on the operational side and let her handle the estate matters since she understood the legal complexities better than I did. He paused. I let her handle it, Mom. I always let her handle it. It was easier. Easier for whom, Daniel? He did not answer that. He did not need to. I reached across the table and, for the first time since Richard's funeral, took my son's hand in mine, the way I used to when he was small and frightened of something he could not name. I am not asking you to choose between your wife and your mother, I said, though we both understood, even as I said it, that this was exactly what I was asking, however gently I addressed the request. I am asking you to choose the truth, Daniel, whatever it costs you. Because in 10 days, the truth is coming out regardless of what you decide today. The only question that remains is whether you want to be standing on the right side of it when it does. Daniel did not answer me that day. He sat across from me in that old vinyl booth, his eggs going cold, and said nothing at all, and I understood, driving home afterward, that I had given him every opportunity a mother could reasonably give a grown man to find his own courage, and whatever he chose to do with that opportunity was no longer something I could control. He chose, in the end, to say nothing to Vanessa about our conversation. Diane confirmed this 2 days later, through channels I did not ask her to explain, and I understood it for exactly what it was, not an act of loyalty to his wife, but simply the same paralysis that had defined my son's entire adult life, a man so unaccustomed to making his own decisions that even the discovery of his wife's fraud could not shake him loose from the habit of doing nothing at all. It would take another 9 months after everything came to light, before Daniel finally found the courage to make a decision entirely his own. But that lunch, I believe, planted whatever small seed eventually grew into it. The night before the will reading, I sat alone in Richard's study one final time, holding his notebook, and I spoke to him the way I had every night since his funeral, as though he could still hear me. You were always more trusting than me, I told the empty room. You believed in people even when the evidence said otherwise. I love that about you. But this, Richard, this I cannot let stand. Not for me. For everything we built. For every year we spent eating cold sandwiches in the cab of that first delivery van, fighting for every contract, refusing to let anyone tell us we couldn't build something lasting. I am not going to let them turn it into a weapon they used to bury us both. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully, the same lavender suit Richard had loved, and I drove to the private banking suite where Christopher Doyle had scheduled the formal reading of what he and Vanessa believed was Richard's final amended will. Marcus Bell met me in the parking garage, along with 2 other people I had asked to be present. Diane Okafor, carrying a slim leather portfolio, and Ruth Alvarado, who had insisted, with fierce loyalty, on standing beside me for whatever came next. Are you ready? Marcus asked. I have been ready for 38 years, I said. I simply did not know it until 3 weeks ago. We walked into the building together, and I took my seat in the back row of the conference table, exactly where my family expected to see me, quiet, small, defeated. Vanessa arrived 12 minutes later, resplendent in black, my mother's pearls at her throat. Daniel followed her, unable to meet my eyes. Christopher Doyle sat at the head of the table with a leather folder in front of him, and Gregory Sands, uninvited by anyone but clearly expected by Vanessa, slipped into a chair near the window with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself entirely untouchable. And then, exactly as I described at the beginning of this story, Vanessa leaned back in her chair, looked at me with open contempt, and told me not to expect a penny. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply folded my hands and waited. 4 seconds later, Marcus Bell walked through that door and placed a sealed envelope directly in front of Vanessa. Before Mr. Doyle proceeds with whatever document he intends to read today, Marcus said, his voice carrying the calm, unshakable authority that had won him 3 decades of courtroom victories, I would like to introduce myself properly. My name is Marcus Bell. I have represented Eleanor and Richard Whitfield for 19 years, and I am here today to inform this room that the document Mr. Doyle is about to read does not reflect the legitimate final wishes of my late client. The color drained from Christopher Doyle's face so quickly I nearly felt sorry for him. Nearly. Vanessa's composure cracked for just a moment, a flicker of confusion crossing her perfectly composed features before the mask slid back into place. Excuse me? This document was properly executed and witnessed. I don't know what you're implying, but I am implying, Marcus said, opening his own folder with deliberate, unhurried precision, that the trust amendment executed 11 months ago was procured through fraudulent misrepresentation of Richard Whitfield's mental competency, drafted by an attorney with an undisclosed conflict of interest connected to this family, and signed under circumstances that will not survive even preliminary judicial review. I am further prepared to demonstrate that during the same period this fraudulent amendment was being engineered. Gregory Sands, seated at this table, was actively embezzling funds from Whitfield Logistics through a shell consulting firm operated in partnership with his sister-in-law, funds totaling over $5 million diverted from company accounts over the course of nearly 2 years. The room erupted into exactly the kind of chaos I had spent 3 weeks quietly, patiently constructing. Gregory Sands shot up from his chair by the window, his face flushing a deep, panicked red. This is absurd. I have no idea what he's talking about. Eleanor, whatever they've told you, this is— Sit down, Mr. Sands, said a new voice from the doorway, and I felt something in my chest settle into place, quiet and cold and satisfying, as 2 plainclothes investigators from the district attorney's white-collar crimes division stepped into the room, followed by Renata Cole herself, her badge already visible on her belt. Gregory Sands, Renata Cole said, her voice carrying easily across the stunned silence of the room, you are being detained pending formal charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit financial exploitation of an elder. Christopher Doyle, the same charges apply to you, along with document fraud related to the falsified execution of the Whitfield Family Trust Amendment. Vanessa's face had gone entirely white now, the pearls at her throat suddenly looking less like an inheritance and more like a noose. This has nothing to do with me, she said, her voice climbing higher, sharper. The composed authority she had walked into that room with entirely evaporated. I don't know anything about embezzlement. Daniel, tell them I don't. We have text messages, Vanessa, Marcus said quietly, sliding a printed page across the table, the same page Diane had shown me weeks earlier. Dated 8 months ago. Would you like me to read them aloud for the room, or would you prefer to review them yourself first? Vanessa did not reach for the page. She stared at it as though it might bite her, her hands trembling in her lap, and I watched, with an emotion I am not proud of but will not deny feeling, as the woman who had spent 3 weeks earlier telling me not to expect a single penny of my own husband's fortune came face to face with the collapse of everything she had spent years quietly engineering. Christopher Doyle, meanwhile, had begun frantically gathering the papers in front of him, as though physically removing the fraudulent will from the table might somehow undo what had already been set in motion. One of the investigators moved quietly to his side, a firm hand settling on his shoulder, and Doyle froze mid-motion, his face the color of ash. Renata, Marcus said, gesturing toward the envelope still sitting untouched in front of Vanessa, I believe you'll also want to enter into evidence the recording Mrs. Whitfield recovered from her husband's safety deposit box, dated 4 days prior to his death, in which Richard Whitfield explicitly states he had not signed and did not intend to sign any trust amendment without first consulting his original attorney and his wife. A murmur moved through the small gathering of witnesses I had asked Marcus to arrange, longtime employees and family friends who had come, at my quiet request, to witness whatever unfolded that morning, people who had known Richard for decades and who now sat listening to proof, delivered in his own voice from beyond the grave, that the amendment Vanessa and Doyle had spent months constructing was built entirely on a lie. That recording is inadmissible, Doyle said weakly, though even he seemed to understand, hearing his own voice crack on the words, that the objection carried no real weight in a room that had already seen investigators walk through the door. It will be admissible in the criminal proceedings that follow this meeting, Renata Cole said evenly, and I suspect, Mr. Doyle, you'll have considerably larger concerns than evidentiary technicalities within the hour. Gregory Sands, still standing near the window, made one final, desperate attempt at composure, straightening his jacket as though the gesture alone might restore some fraction of his authority. Eleanor, he said, his voice suddenly soft, almost pleading, the tone of a man realizing too late that charm had never actually worked on me the way it had worked on everyone else in that boardroom over the years. We've known each other a long time. Surely there's a way to handle this quietly between family without. You are not family, Gregory, I said, and it was the first time my voice had risen above a calm, level register since I had walked into that room. You never were. You were an employee my husband trusted, and you spent 8 years using that trust to build a private fortune off the backs of people who worked the loading docks for a fraction of what you stole. There is nothing quiet left to discuss. Vanessa, beside him, let out a short, bitter laugh, the sound of someone watching their own carefully built world crack apart in real time. You always thought you were so much smarter than the rest of us, she said, looking at me directly for the first time since the meeting began. Sitting in the back row, playing the grieving widow. You knew this whole time, didn't you? You let us walk into this. I let you show this room exactly who you are, I said. I did not have to teach you deception, Vanessa. You brought that with you the day you married my son. The investigators moved forward then, and the room dissolved into the kind of controlled chaos that follows every arrest I have since learned to recognize from my many hours in that courtroom over the following months. Raised voices, hurried explanations no one was listening to, the particular silence of people watching consequences finally arrive after believing, for so long, that they had outrun them entirely. Daniel, beside her, had gone entirely silent, his eyes moving between his wife and the sealed envelope in front of her, and I could see, even from across the table, the exact moment my son finally understood the scope of what his passive, unquestioning devotion to his wife had cost him. Dad found the discrepancies, I said quietly, and every eye in the room turned toward me. It was the first time I had spoken since Vanessa's opening declaration. He kept a notebook. He documented everything quietly for nearly a year, because he loved this family too much to believe what the evidence was telling him. He was planning to sit me down and tell me everything after Sophie's wedding, because he didn't want to disrupt her happiness. He died 2 weeks before he got that chance. I looked directly at Daniel, my son, the boy I had rocked to sleep, the boy I had driven to soccer practice and helped with algebra homework and cried over on his own wedding day 11 years earlier, believing foolishly that I was watching him build a life as solid as the one his father and I had built. Your father trusted people too easily, I said. It was his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. I loved him for it, even when it worried me. But I am not your father, Daniel. And I have spent the last 3 weeks making absolutely certain that no one in this family ever mistakes me for someone who can be quietly pushed to the back row again. The formal legal proceedings that followed consumed the better part of the next 8 months. Though the outcome, once the forensic evidence was fully entered into the record, was never seriously in doubt. I attended nearly every hearing, sitting in the second row of the courtroom beside Marcus, dressed each time in something Richard would have recognized, something that made me feel, in some small way, that he was sitting beside me still. The preliminary hearings were tedious in the way legal proceedings so often are, long stretches of procedural motions and document authentication that tested my patience far more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. But I did not miss a single one, because I understood, somewhere in those long months, that showing up mattered, that the woman who sat quietly and consistently in that courtroom was building her own kind of testimony, whether or not she ever said a word. The most difficult day by far was the day Gregory Sands took the stand as part of his cooperation agreement and described, in flat, clinical detail, exactly how the scheme had been constructed. He explained how Vanessa had first approached him at a charity gala nearly 2 years earlier, reconnecting after years of distance from their business school days, and how the conversation had begun innocently enough, 2 old acquaintances catching up, before gradually, over the following months, evolving into something considerably more calculated. She understood the company's internal controls better than most people realized. Gregory testified, avoiding my eyes entirely throughout his testimony, though I made certain to sit exactly where he could not avoid seeing me if he chose to look up. She knew Richard trusted his family implicitly, and she knew that trust created blind spots. She proposed the Shell consulting arrangement first, small amounts, easily justified. It was only later, once that was already running smoothly, that she began discussing the trust amendment. And when did you become aware, the prosecutor asked, that Mrs. Whitfield's health was being used as a pretext to justify the amendment? Around the time she brought in Christopher Doyle, Gregory said. She told me directly that the diminished capacity narrative would only need to hold up long enough to get through the signature and, if necessary, survive one legal challenge. She said Eleanor would be too grief-stricken to contest anything quickly, and that by the time any challenge could gain traction, the assets would already be restructured in ways that would be difficult to unwind. I sat perfectly still through that testimony, my hands folded in my lap exactly as they had been in the conference room the day the truth finally broke open, and I did not allow myself to cry, not there, not in front of the woman who had once worn my mother's pearls to that very room and told me not to expect a single penny. Vanessa's own testimony, delivered several weeks later as part of her plea negotiations, was considerably less forthcoming, offered in the careful, lawyered language of someone determined to minimize her own culpability while avoiding outright perjury. She admitted to recommending Christopher Doyle to Richard, admitted to being aware of what she called irregularities in the estate planning timeline, but insisted repeatedly that she had never personally directed Gregory's financial activities, a claim that the prosecution's forensic accountants, along with Diane's exhaustive paper trail, made increasingly difficult for anyone in that courtroom to believe. It was during a recess in that same hearing, standing in the hallway outside the courtroom, that Vanessa approached me for the only time during the entire 8 months of proceedings. Her attorney tried to steer her away, but she brushed past him, standing close enough that I could still smell the same perfume she had worn to Sophie's wedding. "You think you've won something," she said quietly, her voice stripped of the polished confidence I remembered from the conference room. "But you're 72 years old, Eleanor. However this ends, you're going to spend whatever years you have left running a company alone, without a husband, with a son who barely speaks to you and a granddaughter who's going to grow up resenting you for destroying her family." I looked at her for a long moment, and I felt, to my own surprise, not anger, but something closer to pity, though I did not let it soften my voice. "You mistake me for a woman who measures her life by what she has left to lose," I said. "I built an empire out of nothing beside a man I loved for 48 years. I have buried that man, and I have survived the betrayal of people I trusted with everything. There is very little left in this world that frightens me, Vanessa, and certainly nothing you have the power to take from me that I am not already fully prepared to live without. You, on the other hand, are about to discover exactly how small your world becomes once the only thing holding it together was a lie." She did not respond. Her attorney finally succeeded in guiding her back into the courtroom, and I never spoke to her directly again. Christopher Doyle lost his law license permanently and accepted a plea deal that included restitution and a suspended sentence in exchange for detailed testimony about the backdated documents and the manufactured medical narrative he had helped construct around Richard's supposed diminished capacity, a narrative that, once exposed, was thoroughly and humiliatingly dismantled by 3 separate physicians who had treated Richard in his final year and confirmed, under oath, that he had shown no signs whatsoever of cognitive decline. Vanessa was charged as a co-conspirator in the estate fraud, though proving the full extent of her involvement in the embezzlement itself proved more difficult, given how carefully she had insulated herself from direct financial transactions. In the end, she accepted a plea agreement that included a felony conviction for conspiracy, a substantial fine, and 5 years of probation, narrowly avoiding prison time in exchange for her own cooperation and, I suspect, no small amount of skillful legal maneuvering from an expensive defense attorney funded, ironically, by money that technically still belonged to me. Daniel was never criminally charged. The prosecutors determined, and I ultimately agreed, that his role had been one of willful blindness rather than active conspiracy, a man who had simply signed whatever his wife placed in front of him without ever asking the questions a responsible partner and son should have asked. But willful blindness, I came to understand over those difficult months, is its own kind of betrayal, and I was not prepared to simply pretend it away because he had not personally forged a document or wired a fraudulent payment. The original trust, the one Richard and I had built together 38 years earlier, stood as legally valid once the fraudulent amendment was formally voided by the court. Every dollar, every share of Whitfield Logistics, every asset Richard and I had spent our lives accumulating, returned fully to my control, exactly as it had always been intended. I did not simply resume my old life, however. I could not after everything I had learned about the family I had spent decades believing was solid ground beneath my feet. I removed Gregory Sansa's replacement financial systems entirely, reinstating the original audit protocols Richard and I had established decades earlier, protocols designed specifically to prevent exactly the kind of quiet, distributed embezzlement that had nearly bled our company dry. I promoted Ruth Alvarado to Chief Operating Officer, a position she had earned a decade earlier and been denied only because of the quiet politics Gregory Sands had cultivated during his tenure. I personally called every employee who had been forced out under manufactured performance complaints during Gregory's years of consolidating power, offering reinstatement, back pay, and formal apologies for a wrong the company had allowed to happen under my own name. I also spent the first several months after the trial simply walking the floors of our distribution centers again, something I had not done consistently in years, ever since I had stepped back from daily operations to focus on our philanthropic work. I wanted employees to see my face, to know that the woman who had built this company alongside Richard Whitfield had not vanished into quiet grief, had not been erased by the family drama that had, inevitably, made its way into local business news coverage during the trial. I shook hands with warehouse managers who had worked for us for over 20 years. I sat with young drivers on their lunch breaks, listening to their concerns about scheduling and benefits, taking notes the old-fashioned way, in a small notebook not unlike the one Richard had kept in his final months. Several employees told me, quietly, that morale had suffered badly during Gregory's tenure, that people had grown afraid to raise concerns, afraid of being quietly pushed out the way Ruth and others had been. I made it my personal mission in those first months to rebuild something that fraud and fear had eroded, a culture where people felt safe telling the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient, even when it implicated someone powerful. Daniel and I did not speak for nearly 4 months after the formal legal proceedings concluded. I needed that distance, I think, more than he did. Time to sit with the full weight of what it meant that my own son had stood in front of me at his daughter's wedding and told me I was not on the list, while simultaneously knowing, on some level he must have known, that his wife was actively working to erase me entirely from the family we had built. When we finally did speak, it was Daniel who called, not me, on a quiet Sunday evening nearly 5 months after the will reading that had changed everything. He asked if he could come by the house. I said yes. He arrived looking older than his 42 years, thinner, his shoulders carrying a weight I do not think he had ever fully understood how to carry before. We sat in Richard's study, the same room where I had spent so many nights those months earlier, holding my husband's notebook, preparing for the fight of my life, and Daniel did not offer excuses. He simply cried, the way I had not seen him cry since he was a small boy, and told me he was sorry, that he had spent his entire marriage letting Vanessa make every decision because it was easier, because he had never learned how to stand on his own 2 feet, because somewhere along the way he had confused loving his wife with never questioning her, and that confusion had cost him everything that actually mattered. I will not pretend that conversation healed everything instantly. It did not. Trust, once shattered so completely, does not simply reassemble itself because someone finally offers a sincere apology, however overdue. But it was a beginning, and at 73 years old, having buried a husband and nearly lost an entire life's work to the people closest to me, I had learned enough by then to know that beginnings matter, even small ones, even imperfect ones. Over the following year, Daniel and I rebuilt something slower and steadier than what we'd had before, something less dependent on the easy assumptions of family and more grounded in the actual deliberate work of earning each other's trust again. He asked to return to the company in a reduced role, no longer an executive with sweeping authority, but a regional operations manager, a position several levels below where he had once sat, one that required him to report to Ruth Alvarado, the very woman his wife's ally had once pushed to the margins. He accepted the demotion without complaint, and over the months that followed, I watched him work harder and more honestly than I had seen him work in a decade, as though the humiliation of the previous year had finally burned away whatever complacency had settled into him during his years of simply deferring to Vanessa's judgment. Vanessa and Daniel eventually divorced, roughly a year after everything came to light, a separation that surprised almost no one who had watched the proceedings unfold. Vanessa moved to a smaller city 3 states away, taking with her considerably less than the $50 million she had once so confidently promised herself. And I have not spoken with her since the day the divorce was finalized, nor do I intend to. Sophie, my granddaughter, chose, in the end, to remain close to me, a decision that meant more to me than I have adequate words to express. She calls every Sunday. She visits the office sometimes, curious about the company her grandparents built from nothing, and last spring she asked, tentatively, whether I might consider bringing her on in an entry-level role once she finished her graduate studies, not because she expected it handed to her, she was careful to say, but because she wanted to learn the business the way I had from the ground up, understanding every part of what it took to build something worth protecting. I told her yes on one condition, that she start exactly where I started, answering phones and learning the books by hand, understanding every dollar before she was ever trusted with decisions about millions of them. She agreed without hesitation, and something in that agreement, that willingness to earn rather than simply inherit, told me more about her character than any wedding seating chart ever could. Sophie also did something I had not expected, something that moved me more than almost anything else that happened in the years following the trial. On the first anniversary of Richard's death, she organized a small gathering at the very warehouse where our company had begun, the same building, still standing, that we had converted years earlier into a modest employee training center. She invited longtime employees, people who had known Richard since the earliest days, and she asked me quietly if I would be willing to tell the story of how the company started, the real story, not the polished version that appeared in press releases, but the one about cold sandwiches and borrowed trucks and two young people who refused to give up on each other or on the thing they were building together. I stood in that same warehouse, decades after Richard and I had first signed the lease with more hope than money, and I told that story to a room full of people who had, in one way or another, become the family I had feared I'd lost entirely. Sophie sat in the front row, taking notes. The way she takes notes on everything now, determined. She told me afterward to understand every chapter of the story before she ever tried to write her own. I established, in the year following the trial, a foundation in Richard's name, dedicated to providing free financial literacy education and fraud protection resources for elderly widows and widowers, people who, like me, might otherwise find themselves isolated, grieving, and vulnerable to the kind of quiet, patient manipulation that nearly cost me everything Richard and I spent our lives building. I have spoken now at dozens of community centers and senior living facilities, telling women my age and older that grief does not make you weak, that the people who count on your sorrow to make you passive are counting on the wrong woman, and that it is never, ever too late to fight for what is rightfully yours. The foundation has, in its first 2 years, helped nearly 400 widows and widowers review estate documents, identify irregularities, and, in 11 documented cases, formally intervene before fraudulent trust amendments or predatory financial arrangements could be finalized. Diane Okafor now works with us part-time, training a small team of volunteer forensic accountants to help families who cannot otherwise afford the kind of investigation that saved me. Ruth Alvarado sits on the foundation's board, alongside Marcus Bell, who insisted on offering his services pro bono for any client who could not afford legal representation. It has become, in its own way, as meaningful to me as the company itself, a living continuation of the promise Richard made me all those decades ago in that cold parking lot, that we would build something that outlasted both of us, something that meant more than the money it eventually generated. I still keep Richard's notebook in the top drawer of his desk, the same drawer where I found it that terrible, clarifying morning after Sophie's wedding. I take it out sometimes on quiet evenings, and I read his careful, worried handwriting, the entries of a man who loved his family so completely that he could not quite bring himself to believe they were capable of betraying him, right up until the moment he ran out of time to find out for certain. I finished what he started. I am certain somewhere, wherever he is now, he knows that. I like to believe he is not surprised. He always told me, back in the earliest days of our marriage, sitting together in that first battered delivery van with nothing but a dream and $100 between us and disaster, that I was the fiercest person he had ever met, and that anyone foolish enough to underestimate me would eventually learn precisely how wrong they had been. He was right about that, as he was right about so many things in the nearly 5 decades we spent building a life together. I only wish he had lived long enough to watch it proven true one final time, sitting beside me in that conference room instead of resting somewhere I could not reach him, his voice preserved only on a small recorder I now keep, along with his notebook, in the top drawer of a desk that still smells, faintly, of his pipe tobacco, even years later, even now. They did. Every single one of them learned it in that conference room on the day they believed they had already won. Family, I have come to understand in the years since, is not simply a matter of blood, or marriage, or the names written on a legal document. It is a matter of loyalty earned and re-earned every single day through choices rather than obligations. I lost, in the span of a single terrible season, the husband I loved for 48 years, and the illusion of a family I had spent decades believing was unshakable. But I did not lose myself. I found, instead, the same woman who had once sat beside a young, determined man in a rented delivery van, refusing to be told no, refusing to disappear quietly into someone else's version of how her life should end. I have told this story now more times than I can easily count, to rooms full of widows who arrive certain their own strength died along with their husbands, and I tell them all the same thing every time, because it is the truest thing I know. The strength was never borrowed from the man beside you. It was always yours. Grief simply makes it harder for a while to remember where you set it down. A woman does not have to be young to fight. She does not have to be loud or angry or reckless. She simply has to remember, even in her deepest grief, even when the people closest to her try to convince her that her time has passed, that the fire which built an empire from nothing does not simply extinguish itself because the world expects an old woman to sit quietly in the back row. I think often now about the difference between the woman I was on that first night after the wedding, sitting alone in Richard's study with nothing but a notebook and a growing suspicion, and the woman I became by the time I walked into that conference room 3 weeks later. I did not become someone new. That is the part one most want the women who hear my story to understand. I did not discover some hidden reserve of strength I had never possessed before. I simply stopped allowing my grief to be mistaken for surrender. Grief and weakness are not the same thing. However much the world likes to conflate them, however convenient it is for people with something to gain to assume that a woman in mourning has nothing left to defend. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house after you bury someone you have loved for nearly 5 decades. I have learned to live inside that quiet now, to let it exist alongside the noise of running a company again, of raising foundation funds, of watching my granddaughter grow into a woman I am prouder of with each passing year. The quiet does not go away. I do not think it is meant to. But it no longer frightens me the way it did in those first raw weeks, when I sat in a folding chair at the back of my granddaughter's wedding, watching a life I no longer recognized unfold 40 yards away from where I had been permitted to sit. I sat in that back row once. I will never sit there again.